So the question is, where did this intrusion of politically charged curricula come from? Now, cultural transformation is underway in America, and our children's education is at the center of it. The inclusion of current social justice ideology into school curricula at all levels has recently become a major topic of discussion in both traditional media and social media. It is occurring across the nation in inner city schools, suburban schools, and in exclusive private schools. Many of us for the first time hear about this thing called critical race theory. Few of us have a clear conception of what it is, but we know it is controversial and that it has permeated our schools. We are aware that somehow it is connected to the civil unrest we saw on the television last summer. There are no rigorous studies demonstrating the benefits of teaching critical race theory on student outcomes, nor is there evidence that it prepares students for college or for participation in American economic or civic life. But for its advocates, that is not the point. Critical race theory provides an academic veneer to a political movement that seeks to transform the country and replace its founding creed. The drift away from traditional curricula has been underway for over a half a century, but only recently has it become the center of public discourse. Now, across the country, revisions in history and social studies curricula reveal a dramatic departure from traditional lessons. For mainstream Americans, these changes should be of interest. And for American Jews, there is a particular concern. New curricula put American Jews and support for Israel on the wrong side of civil rights and social justice movements. Now, CAMERA's mission is to promote accurate coverage of Israel and the Middle East conflict. So why are we interested in broader changes sweeping American education? I think it is helpful to review the broader context because the fundamental changes in how Americans are educated profoundly impacts our mission. So here's some historic context to the current educational crisis. An educated populace was crucial to the civic society envisioned by America's colonial settlers and revolutionary leaders. Just 5 years after the first Puritans arrived from England, they established Boston Latin High School. A year later, in 1636, Harvard College was founded. In 1642, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a law requiring that children be taught to read and write and do basic arithmetic. Failure to do so resulted in a fine. In 1647, another law required that all towns establish and fund public schools. Any town with 50 or more families was required to hire a schoolmaster. This emphasis on compulsory education was revolutionary for its time, where formal education was mainly limited to the privileged. Education was a priority to the New Republic's founders. Revolutionary leader and later President John Adams was a champion of public education, and in 1789, Massachusetts was the first state to pass a comprehensive education law. Thomas Jefferson wrote that public education was essential to survival of the Republic. Jefferson's warning over mixing politics and religion could today be extended to any ideology that undermines America's founding creed. Critical race theory, like Marxism or eugenics, can be covered in the classroom, but should not be uncritically presented as truth. Teaching the founding principles has guided our nation's history and civics curriculum for over 2 centuries. Since the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the major goals of education were to produce a populace capable of civic participation in our representative form of government and to instill in all citizens a shared identity rooted in our founding principles. Education was not just reserved for the white majority either. In 1845, Massachusetts passed a law providing public education for all children, including Black children in non-segregated classrooms. The Massachusetts law points to a unique aspect of American education: local control over what children learn. State governments also have an accepted role in guiding curriculum content and in teacher licensure. Our country's founders, however, excluded the education of children from any of the powers given to the federal government. The principle of local control has been compromised over time, as many were persuaded that federal intervention in education is necessary to redress racial differences in outcomes perceived to result from unequal funding and segregated schools. This led to the creation of a federal Department of Education in the 1970s. Federal involvement may reach a new level if the Biden administration follows through on its stated intent to provide federal grants to promote the teaching of critical race theory. This would be a direct intervention in curriculum content. Now, the main focus of federal programs in education has been to close the gap in academic achievement between Black and white students. This focus disregards two authoritative studies, the Moynihan Report and the Coleman Report, both in the 1960s, that indicated the family environment was the key factor in determining educational outcomes, not the schools. Despite enormous funding allocations over the past 50 years in programs like Head Start and No Child Left Behind, the gap remains little changed. So how does that relate to CAMERA's mission to promote accurate coverage of Israel and expose anti-Jewish tropes in the media and academia? Well, at the most basic level, the traditional emphasis on inculcating Americans with allegiance to the creed of individual freedom and limited government has served American Jews well, insulating them from the bitter experiences of their ancestors in both Europe and the Middle East. It has provided a path to acceptance while still allowing Jews to preserve precious elements of their background. America's founding creed has also fostered a climate in which support for Israel, a nation that shares many of America's founding principles, is uncontroversial. This has enabled Jews to be both patriotic Americans and committed to the survival of Israel and not feel compelled to renounce one or the other when challenges to loyalty surfaced. Now, this founding creed has long been challenged by a competing educational creed referred to as progressivism. As Katrin described in her presentation, education has taken a turn in America that threatens the acceptance of Jews. This change reflects the increasing presence of a distorted manifestation of the progressivist educational philosophy. Now, starting in the 1800s, in response to the Industrial Revolution and expanding urban society, some contended that modern society was too complex to be governed by the founding principles formulated in the 18th century. Their new ideas were collectively labeled progressivism. Progressivism diverged from our founding creed by contending that truths were not permanent but changed as society changed. Progressivism tended to give greater weight to group rights over individual freedom. Echoes of this fundamental philosophical difference are found in the contemporary debates over societal goals of equality versus equity. From progressivist ideas, an educational philosophy emerged in the middle of the 19th century. During the early 20th century, championed by John Dewey and Columbia Teachers College, it made major inroads into education. So how was the progressivist educational policy put into practice? Progressivist pedagogy treats the teaching of history and civics as a tool to inculcate students with emergent truths and encourage social activism in order to transform a flawed society. In practice, progressivist pedagogy disdains old methods that emphasize rote memorization of important facts and dates, and instead emphasizes the learning process. Although studies of student achievement confirm the effectiveness of traditional methods, American educators have inclined toward progressivist models of education. Now, a frequently encountered example of putting process ahead of content are the statements of school officials boasting of their curriculum's emphasis on encouraging critical thinking rather than simply having teachers lecture and fill students' heads with facts. The problem here is that education researchers have found that in order for competent critical thinking to take place, it requires students to have adequate content knowledge and be given an honest appraisal of the facts. Otherwise, curricula that allege to promote critical thinking actually end up doing the opposite and engage in indoctrination. Now, we commonly encounter this problem of putting the cart before the horse when teachers encouraging critical thinking without first providing strong grounding in the facts in units about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We find units where students are encouraged to role play and offer their opinions on resolving the conflict, but are provided only with information from unreliable sources that often don't reflect mainstream scholarship. And that points to another feature frequently encountered in the practice of progressivist pedagogy, the disdain for established classics and accepted history in favor of contemporary fashionable interpretations, often the journalistic approach to history. So where does critical race theory come in? Now, progressivist ideas have long been susceptible to the influence of Marxist doctrine, and over time the two have become intertwined. American education has veered further and further to the left. Critical race theory is a derivative of critical theory, as Jonah discussed, a neo-Marxist philosophy developed in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s during a period of waning confidence in Western democracies. Defining critical race theory is elusive, but all definitions contain common elements. One's group identity, particularly one's race, determines one's reality. As the author of a seminal book advancing critical race theory, Richard Delgado wrote, quote, "Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law," end quote. A Heritage Foundation monograph on critical race theory explains that, quote, "Under identity politics, America is no longer a country where the individual is the central agent in society who possesses individual rights. Instead, membership in the official categories becomes the identity that matters when it comes to rights, responsibilities, and everything else. Victimhood is what commands attention, respect, and entitlements, seen as compensatory justice," end quote. Now, this new framework of viewing society was envisioned by Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, a liberation theologist and Marxist, whose work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, published in 1968, is a seminal text for advocates of critical pedagogy. Freire divided society into oppressors and the oppressed. In his view, education is never neutral or apolitical. It either serves the oppressor or enables the oppressed to liberate themselves. The fact that critical pedagogy's objective is political is one reason its opponents have struggled to discredit it by pointing to its lack of academic merit. Conventional measures of academic merit are irrelevant to its proponents. An example currently at the center of debate is the teaching of our country's founding. Conventional accounts of America's founding point out that its principles are derived from English tradition, and those who played the most important roles are overwhelmingly males of English descent. Those that are inclined to cast white males as oppressors and condemn Western culture as irredeemably flawed reject this account of history and want to replace it. Under the new paradigm, America is a society built on systemic racism and white privilege. The long accepted figures of historical importance are diminished in stature. A consequence of this revised historical account is the devaluation of the enlightened concepts about society that these important figures debated and brought to life. So where do Jews fit? As Katrin demonstrated in her presentation, the critical race theory proponents categorize Jews as oppressors. Because Jews are able to blend into white society and have achieved success in American society as it is currently configured, the critical race theorists even came up with a term to describe this. It's called white adjacency. This identity-based ideology does not acknowledge that success is mainly the result of individual initiative and luck. Instead, they believe societal rewards should be parceled out among groups based on a determination of equity. Since Jews are considered beneficiaries of white privilege, they are deemed to have unfairly reaped rewards. As the recent controversy over the California Ethnic Studies curriculum revealed, the status of Jews is a flashpoint. It is striking that of the nearly 90,000 comments submitted by the public to the California Department of Education relating to this new proposed curriculum, nearly half dealt with concerns over how Jews in Israel were portrayed. And so what is the connection to anti-Israel curricula? Anti-Israel activists recognized early on the opportunity that the social justice movement offered as a vehicle to advance their cause, especially among the young and impressionable, often filled with idealism but lacking direction. Ethnic studies infused with critical race theory provided the pedagogical platform. The new framework finds a parallel to America's founding in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is portrayed as a dispute between white colonial settlers and indigenous non-white inhabitants. The Jews are cast as the oppressors and the Palestinian Arabs the oppressed. Now, the Palestinians have successfully donned the identity of non-white victims of white supremacist Zionists. They have imputed a connection between Palestinians living under so-called Israeli occupation and Blacks in the South prior to the Civil Rights Movement or Black South Africans during the apartheid regime. They have also defined Palestinians as indigenous victims of settler colonialism and analogized this status for the tragic history of American Indians. Now, in this oppressor-oppressed narrative, facts and context that don't support the politically devised narrative are discarded or falsified. Omission is an especially devious practice. For example, in units teaching about the conflict, they often select the turn of the 20th century as a starting point for recounting the land's history, at a time when Arabs residing on the land far outnumbered the tiny remnant Jewish population. Now, by choosing this starting point, it establishes the demographic existing at that point in time as the natural state, allowing later proposals to divide the land to be portrayed as unjust. Students are rarely apprised of the full history in which the Jews were once numerous and the sole group to establish autonomy on the land, or that the early 20th century demographics were a consequence of repeated expulsions and aggressions against the former Jewish inhabitants. Without this context, students are led to see Zionism as another example of European colonialists victimizing indigenous inhabitants. Now, we are currently at a pivotal point in American education. 2 generations of teachers have been immersed in an education environment where they are encouraged to accept Marxist and racialist precepts. Education schools are incubators of this ideology, so they are of no help. The teachers' unions are controlled by far-left political activists. The unions promote critical race theory and similar ideas. Now, there is no reason why unions should play a role in developing curricula. So now to look at some examples. First of all, the California Ethnic Studies example, which Katrin spoke of. It is useful to review actual cases to understand how all this plays out. The drawn-out battle over the California Ethnic Studies model curriculum offers us an example. In 2016, California's legislature passed a bill to fund the development of ethnic studies curriculum in public schools. Now, the field of ethnic studies has been a preserve of Marxists and critical theorists, so it was not surprising that its adherents prevailed among those selected to draft a curriculum. The first draft was ready by mid-2019. In the summer of 2019, a curriculum group operating under the aegis of the San Francisco Jewish Community Relations Council led an effort to address anti-Israel and anti-Jewish materials contained in this first draft. The draft included 60 pages on Arab Americans, including anti-Israel and anti-Jewish material. Anti-Semitism was absent from an accompanying glossary listing nearly every imaginable form of prejudice. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, however, was favorably described in the glossary. Now, the JCRC tried to handle the issue discreetly with well-reasoned letters and phone calls to officials. They enlisted the support of California's Legislative Jewish Caucus, and that was an important step. But their efforts to work with education officials to fix the problem stalled. The JCRC did not want to publicize the issue because it perceived the opposing side was better organized and could mobilize far greater numbers in any public confrontation. But the curriculum controversy was leaked, bringing public exposure. In just a 2-week period, the California Department of Education was flooded with 18,000 letters protesting the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic content of this first draft. The anti-Israel side managed a meager 122 letters. That's nearly a 150-to-1 ratio. The public response caused the California Department of Education, at the prompting of the governor and state school board president, to seek a 1-year legislative extension. This stalled passage of the flawed draft and compelled the California Department of Education to promise revisions. Advocates of the original first draft doubled down during that year, using their dominant presence in academia to their advantage. Meanwhile, the JCRC and Jamina, an organization of Middle Eastern Jews, offered units describing the experience of Jews and anti-Semitism, which had been absent in that first draft. In 2020, another attempt by critical race theory proponents to bypass the public through last-minute insertion of biased material into the second draft was stymied by the governor, who, alerted by public action, refused to sign off on the curriculum until changes were made. Then in March 18th, 2021, a fourth draft of the curriculum was approved. Again, in the last minute, the Department of Education swapped out an approved unit on Arab Americans with a politicized unit, bypassing the legally mandated process of 45 days of public comment and formal review. This maneuver of the last minute insertion is a recurring tactic used by these advocates to avoid public scrutiny. Meanwhile, a well-constructed unit of Jews exiled from Arab lands by Jamina was relegated to a secondary status in the curriculum, which means in all likelihood it will be neglected. Many important lessons can be drawn from this controversy. First, public exposure paired with whatever political levers are available are the most effective measures the public can take to challenge politicized curricula. Large numbers matter in speaking out. Second, if you want to ensure that Jews and Israel are portrayed accurately, early involvement in the process is needed. This means representation on committees that review curricula and vetting of the questions on history tests that are given to students. This also means having a say through local political activity, especially presence on school committees. Third, the opposition will employ any method, including last-minute insertions that may not be even consistent with legal mandates. It is necessary to spot these activities and challenge them. And that leads to a fundamental strategic question. Should we accept unscholarly and politically motivated curricula as inevitable? So the best option is to work with curriculum developers and officials to keep the most offensive material out? Or should ethnic studies curriculums be opposed in their entirety, fearing that they will fall under the control of critical race theorists who dominate the discipline and will always be susceptible to anti-Jewish and anti-Israel themes? Now, elsewhere, there are other examples. When political levers are absent and public exposure muted, educators ignore the public. That is what happened in Minnesota with the adoption of a social justice curriculum. 5,000 letters of protest had no effect. In Buffalo, New York, the school system adopted a Black Lives Matter curriculum without opposition. As of yet, there is no anti-Israel component, but the ideological milieu is susceptible to such influences. In Newton, Massachusetts, 10 years of efforts to publicize biased teaching about Israel managed to goad school officials to remove the topic from the world history course. However, a school board in ideological lockstep, uninterested in public concern over the inclusion of unbalanced and unscholarly material, has left the issue unresolved. To this day, a teacher at the high school continues to teach a course he designed for the purpose of inculcating students with his political agenda. In Illinois, an attempt by an anti-Israel curriculum provider to persuade teachers to use its product in a school district was exposed. It generated heated public disapproval and was disavowed by school officials. In Durham, North Carolina, anti-Israel groups like Jewish Voice for Peace have acquired political power and use that power to inject an anti-Israel program into the school curriculum. Recently, the Biden administration has endorsed critical race theory by proposing to offer grants to school systems. This will make it very difficult to oppose. Now I'm going to talk about curriculum standards. State curriculum standards are an underappreciated but crucial component. Proponents of critical race theory seek to inject their ideology into the standards at all grade levels. State curriculum standards are important because they serve as a guide for what teachers teach. If written in a detailed, scholarly manner, they provide solid guidance. Even those in teachers intent on promoting their ideological convictions will find themselves constrained by well-written factual standards. In contrast, standards that are full of jargon and lack specificity offer an opportunity for radical and ignorant teachers to inject their own biased pedagogy. In Massachusetts in 1993, a lawsuit propelled a group of businessmen and legislators to demand outstanding curriculum standards. These standards were released in 2003, And soon, Massachusetts students surged to the top of national assessments in all subjects at all grade levels. Now, while seemingly directed at the students, the real strength of these standards were the demands for knowledge and competence placed upon the teachers. The Massachusetts standards were the first to include a detailed section about ancient Israel as one of the key contributors to Western civilization and the American creed. The high school world history course included a balanced and factual treatment of Israel's establishment. The standard's outstanding results did not give pause to its opponents. The adoption of Common Core in 2010 and the 2018 revision of the Massachusetts standards eroded these standards. Now, parents and citizens can weigh in on standards by communicating with your state education department and with your political representatives. The standards are available to read online. You can access them. For those concerned about the inclusion of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish teaching in school curricula, a crucial item to look for in standards is teaching about ancient Israel, usually in the middle elementary school grades. Anti-Israel educators seek to exclude discussion of ancient Israel as one of the building blocks of Western culture and the United States. Now, by informing students about ancient Israel in earlier grades, students are given a basis for then critically evaluating what they learn on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in later grades, where courses are often quite biased. Another issue is materials promoted to teachers through supplemental teacher education organizations with political and social agendas. Now, for example, in Massachusetts, an outfit that promotes globalism and is funded by the Middle Eastern state of Qatar has gained widespread access to schools. This outfit, called Primary Source, has seminars on a wide range of topics for teachers. It promotes its materials and its ideological agenda through these materials. There are many such groups, and many are funded by foreign entities or wealthy foundations that promote agendas that most parents would probably find alarming if they knew about them. Now, also, I'm going to talk briefly about private schools. The private schools are where some of the most radicalized education curricula occur. This has come out into the open recently with public statements by a few courageous parents whose children attended the Fieldston School, the Dalton School, Heschel School, and Brearley schools, all exclusive private schools in the New York City area. And in the case of a teacher at the Grace Church School, another one, who spoke out, he was ostracized for it. Political pressure is less effective here because no public money is involved. However, other aspects are similar, such as the importance of public exposure and engaging with the school. There's going to have to be a change in the mindset of parents who send their children to private schools. Parents must make it their business to monitor what their children are learning. A year ago, we learned of what was occurring in the Fieldston School in New York City. Unchecked, the school had been instituting racial identity units starting in the early grades for some time. But what drew public exposure was an invited speaker who spouted comments that were offensive to many Jews. Further investigation revealed a teacher intent on spreading an anti-Israel agenda. Sean Cooper's investigation published in the Tablet was particularly informative, and I recommend you look that one up. Over the years, I have been alerted to curriculum problems at exclusive Massachusetts schools as well. Individual parents have spoken out, but mostly there is just acceptance. Now, CAMERA has been involved in school curriculum content issues for over a decade. We see an underserved need to address the challenges students face at every level. Although there is more exposure to the problems of indoctrination and education currently, addressing it remains a problem. A more comprehensive and coherent effort is needed. Jewish groups have lagged behind anti-Israel groups in producing and promoting good curricular materials. CAMERA has curricular materials as well, and we are looking to promote them. School bureaucracies have largely been taken over by far-left advocates or careerists unconcerned with the scholarly merits of school curricula. The one area of remaining advantage for now is the public. Now, in conclusion, parents fear speaking out because they worry about jeopardizing their children's social situation and their children's future. But if those who oversee our children's education are not transparent and accountable, they have to be challenged. There has never been a time as there is now where it is so important for people to get involved and get other people involved. The public must be made aware of what is taught. Despite the heavy indoctrination at schools of education, radicalized teachers probably still do not represent the majority of teachers. There needs to be pushback to teachers' unions' involvement in school curricula. There is an increasing openness to alternative models of education right now as well. Asian Americans seem to be leading the way in this regard. An important idea gaining currency is the portability of taxpayer money associated with each child. If the parents find an alternative school, a charter school, or even a private school, the tax money associated with that child would follow, would go to that school. The governor of West Virginia recently signed a bill allowing for this portability. Several other states are looking to this as well. And now for a final word. The effort to contain the spread into America's schools of curriculum that depicts America and Israel as oppressors requires a long-term commitment. 30 years ago, in December 1990, a letter appeared in the New York Times denouncing what was happening in the letter writer's school system, which was then regarded as among the best in the country. The letter described how the traditional sophomore year world history course had been replaced by new courses that devoted extensive class time to 3 contemporary conflicts: Northern Ireland, Vietnam, and the Middle East. The letter writer wrote of these news courses, quote, "The school committee want to believe that such courses are justified by the needs of the diverse population at the high school. The basic purpose of these and other sophomore courses, however, is to balkanize students ethnically before they take US history in grade 11 and to encourage them to view Britain, America, and Israel as oppressor nations." That New York Times letter writer 30 years ago was Sandra Stotsky. I'm here demonstrating that unbroken commitment. Camera has demonstrated nearly 40 years of commitment to its mission. While Camera's focus is on accurate portrayals of Israel and Jews, these concerns are interwoven with a larger societal educational struggle in which our nation's future is at stake. Thank you for listening.